the agreement makes absolutely clear that nothing in the agreement or any supplementing arrangement shall affect sovereignty. And in the words of my right honourable friend, the Deputy Prime Minister, our commitment to Gibraltar remains, as ever, as solid as the rock. And I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Minister Wendy Morton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Minister for bringing this statement to the House and allowing me to have advance sight. But let me be clear. Parliament is reacting to events rather than being respected as part of the process. For weeks, detailed provisions of this treaty have circulated in the press before members here have been permitted to see any legal text. That is not how serious constitutional business should be conducted. Now we have the text, proper scrutiny must follow in this place and in Gibraltar. As we have consistently said, this must be a deal that the Government, the Parliament and, above all, the people of Gibraltar are comfortable with. It is right that the democratically elected Government of Gibraltar has led negotiations and prioritised a free-flowing border, but trade-offs come with that, and it is our duty to examine them carefully. The Sovereignty Clause states that nothing in the treaty alters the respective legal positions of the UK or Spain. But sovereignty is not simply about words. It is about how arrangements operate in practice. Yeah. What recourse does the United Kingdom have if there is an operational overreach by Spain, including in the exercise of border control powers within Gibraltar's port and airport? Will British citizens be subject to the 90-day Schengen rule in Gibraltar? What is the reciprocal position for Spanish citizens? And what protections exist for British nationals with long-standing ties to Gibraltar who do not hold Gibraltar ID cards? And what mechanisms are in place to resolve disputes when asymmetric decisions are taken at the border? On customs, processing at EU-designated points in Spain and Portugal raises practical and constitutional questions. So what oversight will the UK have, and what recourse exists if those arrangements fail to operate effectively? What protections are there for imports of British goods and for Gibraltar's distinct economic model, particularly its financial services sector? And have the government's impact assessments fully examined UK-Gibraltar trade flows and potential adverse effects? But we must also address dynamic alignment. This treaty does not merely apply a fixed list of EU law. It provides for future EU acts listed in the annexes to be adopted and implemented, with serious consequences if they are not. So can the Minister explain clearly how this mechanism will operate and how Gibraltar and the UK will avoid becoming subject to ongoing EU rule-taking without meaningful political control? On the European Court, the treaty requires consistent interpretation of applicable union law in line with case law of the ECJ. So in which precise areas will EU law bind Gibraltar's domestic arrangements? What assessment has been made of the implications of future rulings for Britain's national interest? I also must draw attention to Article 25 and its reference to the ECHR and ask, can the Minister clarify how that provision operates within the treaty framework, and does adherence to the ECHR form a continuing condition of the agreement? No international agreement should preempt or constrain the sovereign right of this Parliament to determine the UK's constitutional arrangements. So can the Minister confirm that under this treaty, an EU national may have access to Gibraltar through the land border without restrictions, but a British national travelling from the UK could be banned from entering at the airport, including on the say of Spanish border checks? But more broadly, what domestic legislation will be required to give effect to this treaty, and will Parliament have the opportunity to amend it in the normal way? On national security, Gibraltar's naval base is of immense strategic importance. So will the Minister give an absolute assurance from the dispatch box that nothing in this agreement, directly or indirectly, now or through future implementation, can impact the operations, the freedom of action, access arrangements or security of the UK's naval base in any way whatsoever? But finally, Mr Speaker, process does matter. Given the scale of this agreement, it's not possible to cover all of its implications in this short exchange today. There are serious questions about the operation of the border and dual checks, the role of Spanish authorities at the airport, customs and taxation arrangements, business impacts, the adoption of future EU acts listed in the annexes, ECJ interpretation and the domestic legislation required to implement the treaty. The Minister has said this is a draft, so when does he expect it to be finalised? When will the CRAG process begin? There has been talk of early implementation with Gibraltar, suggesting the 10th of April. So can the Minister clarify this, please? Because there must be time for the CRAG process and it must be meaningful. Provisional application on the 10th of April must not reduce parliamentary scrutiny merely to a rubber stamp. Gibraltar has stood resolutely British since 1713. Its people have repeatedly affirmed that choice. Any treaty must be examined line by this Parliament.
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Shadow Minister for her questions. I do have to say, Mr. Speaker, I've been rather disappointed by the tone and indeed the tone taken in the media over the last few days on these issues, not least, Mr. Speaker, as I provided a very fulsome briefing to the Shadow Foreign Secretary on these issues in advance. So the idea that we have not been communicating about this is simply not correct. I'm also happy, in a spirit of generosity, Mr. Speaker, to offer further briefings for the Shadow Minister and the Shadow Foreign Secretary to go through any detail they would like in the treaty. Very happy. There is nothing to hide here. We welcome the scrutiny. We welcome the scrutiny of this House. She asks about the timeline. We, of course, have to respect that this is going through this place. It's also going through processes in the EU. We are committed to that. We're committed to laying forward the finalised text, Mr. Speaker, after signature of the treaty, which we expect to take place next month. And, of course, it will then go through the appropriate processes in relation to CRAG. She asked about sovereignty and she asked about recourse and dispute mechanisms. I mean, firstly, I just need to make absolutely clear that sovereignty was never on the table in these negotiations. It's not in doubt. That is an absolute, and this agreement safeguards that. There are a range of recourse and dispute resolution mechanisms attached to the treaty. She's welcome to go through those. I'm happy to explain them in more detail, and we have very much kept to the double lock which we set out at the start of these processes. She asked about the 90-day rule. Of course, it's not free for British citizens just to turn up in Gibraltar without going through their immigration checks at the moment, and indeed they're already subject to a 90-day rule, and I think this is an important thing to clarify. There seems to have been some misunderstandings of this in relation to all of our overseas territories, Mr. Speaker, recently. It does not have an automatic right. Gibraltar, of course, maintains immigration and security checks. She asks about customs. Gibraltar is not joining the customs union, but it is entering into a bespoke customs arrangement with the EU to ensure that fluidity, crucially, of goods. They have chosen to enter into these arrangements. It's obviously for them to decide what kind of alignment that they need to have in relation to that. Again, I think this does reflect a wider challenge here, Mr. Speaker, which is that the opposition would rather stick in the ideology of the Brexit years rather than pragmatic arrangements that deliver for the people of Gibraltar, or indeed the people of this country. And crucially, this is about facilitating trade. It's about facilitating the flow of goods and indeed removing the checks and delays which have caused such frustration in the past. She asked about the ECJ. I'm happy to speak to her further about that. There's full detail in the treaty. She asked about the ECHR. Of course, we comply with the ECHR. Indeed does Gibraltar, as indeed does Spain and the EU. We don't shy away from that, notwithstanding the reforms that we're seeking in wider debates that are going on outside of this place. She asked for an absolute assurance about our military activities at Gibraltar. I can absolutely assure her that nothing will fetter, either now or in the future, the activities of us to operate unimpeded in the way that we have done, and indeed our allies from the base. That was an absolute condition that we set on this process. And I'm also pleased with the very cooperative approach that we have with Spain. They're a key NATO ally. We cooperate with them in the defence and security of Europe. And I'm glad that we now have a cooperative and positive spirit of engagement, not only with Spain, but with the EU and within a range of partners. Fundamentally, Mr. Speaker, this agreement is good for Gibraltar. It's good for stability. It's good for prosperity. It's good for security. And, Mr. Speaker, it is supported by the government of Gibraltar. And that was our primary concern throughout this process, as well as protecting UK interests in this. And I think we should all respect and get behind the government of Gibraltar in support of this agreement.